Hi everyone, it's David here with a word from our sponsors Hyperx. Hyperx are makers of premium gaming peripherals and they're offering UK-based customers 20% off their entire full-price gaming headset range throughout May. T&Cs apply. Head on over to uk.hyperx, that's hyperx.com, to read the T&Cs and use the discount code Rangers once at the checkout. These are superb. I've been using the headset now for a couple of weeks and it is absolutely fantastic. The mic is brilliant, the immersion is fantastic, and also the noise cancellation is superb. So if you want to get into your own world when you're gaming, or even just when you're doing calls, we live in a Zoom world these days, then this is very much for you. So go to HyperX for it. It's uk.hyperx.com, discount code Rangers once at the checkout, and you will save 20%, and trust me, you will thank me when it happens. In terms of the terms and conditions, offer is subject to availability, no minimum spend required. During May 2021, the code can only be used once, can't be used in conjunction with any other HyperX offer, and is not transferable. Offer is subject to change or withdrawal without notice. Free standard delivery to UK addresses for orders of £79 or more. If you return any headsets purchased with the code, you will receive a refund of the discounted price you paid for the returned headsets. Hello everyone, it's David here and welcome to a brand new show here on the Heart and Hand Network, a show that I've been very much looking forward to doing for about 3 years. It's Steven Gerrard, Evolution of a Revolution. What we're going to be doing over the next 6 weeks is looking at Steven Gerrard's time at Rangers in depth with a specific focus on him, the manager who arrived, the manager who we have in 2021, and the changes that have happened over the last few years, which have taken us from a very bad place, a ship that was going nowhere fast, and turned us into invincible champions. And joining me for this discussion, I'm delighted to say, from the wonderful Four Lads Had a Dream website, it's Stevie Clifford. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending when people are listening, Stevie. I'm delighted to have you here to do this show.
Hi, David. Yeah, delighted to be here as well. It's great to be able to talk about this from such a great position, you know, as champions, and look back through all his time here and really enjoy it and be able to relax and have some fun with it as well.
Yeah, just to let people know what the structure of the show is going to be. This is specifically looking at the manager and his development. And by that, what we mean is things like his tactics, things like his transfer dealings, things like his dealings with the players, things like the media, all of that will be looked at, and we'll go through it season by season. We'll go through it in terms of our overall impressions, and then we'll end up the series, a six-parter, with a Q&A. But today we're going to talk about the man who arrived, our expectations, and really where we were and set the stall. Stevie, you expect people to grow in a job, but in our case, it was something that we were almost counting on, because, with no disrespect meant to the Steven Gerrard who pitched up at Rangers in 2018, he had qualities. That's why he had the job, and we understood that. He was very impressive. We got that. He had this legendary playing career, and he had this status in the world game. But cold truth was he had no top-level coaching experience. He had been a coach a couple of years at Liverpool. And it is a different challenge being a manager to being a player, no matter how many successful dressing rooms you'd been in. And although he'd been at one club, he'd been, various Liverpool iterations. He'd been in a lot of successful dressing rooms. He's led a lot of successful dressing rooms. He had international experience. But it's a big challenge. And to start off at a club like Rangers takes that challenge and just puts it into the stratosphere, really.
Well, it certainly does. And not only to start at a club like Rangers, it's to start at a club like Rangers in the situation we are in at the time he arrived. If we journey back to him arriving, he's arriving basically at a time where, as a squad, we are very, very weak. We're conceding goals like it's going out of fashion. We've basically come off the back of a season where we've conceded 4 or 5 to our nearest rivals. We've drawn in our last game of the season 5-5 at Easter Road. So it's not like he's going into a unit that he can basically take a lot from either. He's got a couple that he can work with, but overall the squad really does need a big overhaul. On top of the fact that this is his first big challenge. But I've got to say, David, I never thought that, on his arrival, it never worried me his lack of experience. And as soon as his first press conference came and he uttered the magic words, "Let's go," I think he had everybody on hooks then.
Yeah, he most certainly did. But let's go back then to season 2017-2018. It seems a bit of an oversight to take a random point or a specific point rather, in the few seasons before that, because it had been such a mess, and obviously it all feeds back to 2011, White takeover, etc. Walter stepping down, and everything sort of spirals downwards from there. But we had got back into the Premier League, which was a staging point, but no more than that. Nobody was fooled that was the journey complete. And I think very quickly we realise in Warburton's first season just how far off the pace we are. It's a good Celtic team, we can't deny that. Brendan Rodgers' first season, and Rangers are very much off the pace under Warburton. He leaves, of course, in the February of that season, and I don't think a lot of tears, Stephen, when he left, because I think there was this feeling which persists. I think we've all probably kept one eye on the career of Mark Warburton since, and it's the same thing. He has some real coaching ability, and it would be unfair to say that he doesn't, but he has flaws, defensively in particular, that he never ever seems to rectify. Not only that he never even seems to attempt to rectify. It's been the same. He went to Nottingham Forest, didn't last there. He's at QPR, where he has done reasonably well. But again, you look at their fans' forums, and we had all the ball and lost 1-0 to set piece. It's common things that we in Forest fans can identify. When he left, did you think it was his time, or were you disappointed?
No, I wasn't disappointed. I think, to be honest, I would have been thinking that it was his time. I remember, David, he left shortly after a real thrashing at Tynecastle, if memory serves me correct. I think we got beat 4-1 possibly.
Yes.
And it was the same stuff. Goals at back post, goals at set pieces. And I think a lot of us by that point were getting a bit fed up of it. Looking back overall on Warburton's kind of spell with us, I think, the first 6, 7, 8 months we had a really good time in terms of performances were good. The feel-good factor was back. Ibrox was full again, good people in charge of the club. Everything felt like it was going in the direction it should. And then it started to unravel slightly in terms of goals we were losing. I remember we lost to Falkirk, and we were 2-0 up and got beat 3-2. Yeah. And people started to point out flaws there that never got rectified. And by the time that we actually went up, we had the Scottish Cup final as well, which we had blown with 10 minutes left. That was, I think, a typical Warburton thing, whereas 2-1 up with 10 minutes left, dead on our feet, we're still trying to attack. And there didn't seem to be any kind of change of philosophy or anything. It was one way. And I think that people, when he didn't adapt, I think that people very quickly began to get murmurs and discontent from that. So when it came to him actually leaving, I don't remember there being a great sense of loss or a sense of disappointment surrounding it. Certainly not. Myself personally, I would have liked to have seen him adapt, because he was a likeable guy, David. I liked him. I thought he spoke well. I thought he carried himself well. And even now, I don't have anything kind of bad to say about Mark Warburton, other than, on the pitch it didn't go the way we wanted it to go. But at the time he left, it was definitely a kind of a mutual parting. I think that's fair to say from everybody. But what happened next was certainly not what we had planned.
No. On Warburton, the Hearts game you mentioned, the reason I felt it was such a perfect bookend was that we'd been to Tynecastle earlier that season, lost 2-0, and he'd said afterwards, as he tended to do, we'll learn from it, we'll go again. Well, then we go back to Tynecastle later in the season And if anything, we're worse, but it's, as you said, the same mistakes. And I thought if you wanted a perfect illustration of why this isn't going to work, it's that. Because there you go, you tell us that you know what's wrong and you'll fix it. Here's the same team, the same circumstance, and the problems are worse. They're not getting better. So, yeah, I was ready for him to go. Graeme Murty stepped in temporary charge and did okay in his spell. More on him later. But after that came how to put this? Came an appointment that I genuinely think in years to come, when the younger generation who are just reading up on this sit down and they'll say to us, so what was all this about? And I'm not sure we'll have an answer. I'm a bit of a football geek. I know a lot of the listeners are football geeks. And generally speaking, I might not know a lot about a football figure. But even if it's just from Champ Manager or Football Manager as it is now, even if it's just from reading World Soccer or whatever, I've generally heard of people, Stevie. I might not know them inside out, but generally speaking, I know the name at least and a little bit of background and maybe the clubs that have been at. I had no idea who Pedro Caixinha was when he was mentioned for the job at first. I was told by someone who must have had some inside knowledge, get some money on this guy, and I think he was 16-1 at the time, and that was because he'd come in quite dramatically that day. And I'm really, Pedro, who's he? And I had to Google him, and I'm not sure for Rangers that's ever really a good thing. But Pedro Caixinha arrived, impressive looking fellow, no doubt about it. Spoke very well, spoke a lot about his tactical ideas, and I wasn't particularly blown away by it, and I don't know anyone who was, and I don't think he ever achieved that sense of anticipation or excitement with the fans. Now, the gamble, Stevie, of bringing someone in late in a season, I personally wouldn't do it, because what happens is what happened here, which is that in theory, we all say, it's not his fault. It's not his team. He's just in to have a look around and get himself settled and be good to go for next season. But when you get cuffed 5-1 at home by Celtic, then some of that mud does stick on the new guy, no matter what anyone says. And what it means is if they get off to a bad start the following season, which he did disastrously in Luxembourg, then fans who never really wanted him anyway, so there's no attachment there, and then don't have any evidence to suggest he's the right guy, want him out the door. And although it would take another few months, from that day in Luxembourg, I thought he's dead man walking.
I actually thought it was a lot sooner than that. I've never heard a reaction at Ibrox for his first game of what he did at half time. And if we journey back to that when we were 1-0 down against Motherwell and he subbed off half the defence, he left Jan Toro, if you remember him. He was at centre back. I think
Halloran was at full back, I think.
Halloran at right back. Lee Wallace was at centre back, I think, next to Toro, and then Halliday at the other side. And we did manage actually to draw that game. Pretty sure that Joey Garner equalised. But at that point, I remember people turning to me and saying, this guy might actually be mental. And, in his philosophies and things that he was doing. And I don't think he ever recovered from that, David, because there was no trust. There was a sense of what are we getting here? And even when we did kind of scrape by in terms of results, and then his comments. I remember the day we won 2-1 at Firhill, and we got treated like the last minute winners and stuff like that. That was more relief than we were actually buying into it. There was a good result up at Pittodrie. We won 3-0. I think we scored 3 in the last 10 minutes. If you remember, Dodu got the third, Kenny Miller got a couple. And that was the first time I actually watched it and thought, right, tactically that was pretty decent, and maybe settling in, that's fine. And very quickly we were thrashed 5-1. But I remember having a conversation with a well-known follow poster, Sir Duncan Ferguson, actually in that summer. We had a bounce game at home to St Johnstone, up at the training ground, and we got beat 1-0. And that was the first time people started to talk about Callum Henry, Colin Henry's son. He scored the goal that day, and we were just a mess. We didn't look very good. We were all over the place in terms of our organisation and things like that. And I said we either wait 3 months and sack this guy, or we cut our losses and sack him now. There was never any time where I fully believed that he was going to turn it round. And as soon as that happened, as you said, out in Luxembourg, I think for everyone, David, that was it. It was only a matter of time. There was never any shoots of recovery. There was never anything to believe in, you know. And the more he spoke, and the more that he kind of lined us up and organised us and everything else, it just wasn't happening. Thankfully, though, I will say that the board didn't prolong it, longer than it needed to be. October 26th, it happened, and I remember because it was my birthday the day after, and he was out the door. So I'm thankful that they immediately corrected the mistake. But not a good appointment, David. I'm all for left field and things like that, but to me, he was a salesman who spoke a good game, but there was nothing to back it up.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before, but we had Clint Hill on for an interview, and what Clint Hill said is he would show us his ideas of how he wanted us to play, but it wasn't realistic for Rangers to play that way because he was showing us clips from his sides in Qatar, and he said, well, it's 50-degree heat in Qatar, so obviously there's a physical impediment to 100-mile-an-hour football. And he said, we're all looking at each other saying, we don't get this time on the ball because we're Rangers. As soon as one of us gets the ball, there's 3 or 4 guys zooming in to kick us. And I think that a bit like Paul Le Guen, he just didn't get it at all. And the idea that you can come in and graft your football and not be aware of the unique challenges of Scottish football, I just don't think. I think anyone coming in with that idea will come a cropper. I mean, yeah, you can get your blend of football in, but blend is the word. You've got to be aware of the circumstances, and I don't think he ever was. So he goes, and then Graeme Murty comes in for another caretaker spell. Rangers have what would turn out to be a pretty strange 6 weeks. Number of people linked. Alex McLeish was strongly linked for a comeback, you'll remember, during this period. But eventually... Yeah. Sorry,
I was going to mention on the Alex McLeish thing, actually, if you remember, the bookmakers stopped taking bets. He was, I think there was a day where more or less we had that news that he was coming. So obviously we know that bookmakers don't really. What am I trying to say? That they can.
It's a small market, yeah, and because any sort of amount. But no, I mean he was seriously quoted. It wasn't just idle speculation. And Derek McInnes seemed to be sort of hovering in the background. And eventually, after 6 weeks, the board decide they will go for Derek McInnes, which did lead to suspicions at best that he was the backup option, that if they had a look around, couldn't find anybody better, and they would go for him. And humiliatingly, there's no point denying it, at the last minute, he backs out. Rangers are left looking rather stupid, and he stays with Aberdeen. And it just felt like that weekend, they said that Graeme Murty would then have it to the end of the season. We went to Kilmarnock, took the lead through Declan John, ended up losing 2-1. To a Chris Boyd goal. And you just thought, when is this going to end? I mean, we are reeling from one disaster to another. Murty starts well. Is trusted with a few signings in January, and they all seem initially to start off quite well. You remember Sean Goss was one, Russell Martin, who on paper seemed a sensible one, Greg Docherty arrived, Sean Goss, and there's actually a wee upturn in form. I think it's, it has to be, that does have to be remembered. There is a little upturn in form at this point, and things seem to be moving in the right direction. And Murty kind of does look like he knows what he's doing, but then, my goodness, when the wheels came off, they went shooting off. Rangers lose 3-2 at home to Celtic in a match that pretty much ensures that Celtic will go on and win the title. It's 2 each when Celtic are Rangers take the lead twice. It's 2 each and playing really well, to be fair. But then defensive errors. Off goes Celtic have Siminovic sent off. They're down to 10 men. Brendan Rodgers makes a couple of tactical changes. Celtic end up running out with a 3.32. And from that, Stevie, the collapse was swift and it did not let up. So much so, after the twin humiliations against Celtic at Hampden and at Parkhead, Rangers lose 4-0 and 5-1, and it could have been more on both games. It could have been double figures in the one that Celtic scored 5, and I'm not exaggerating that. Rangers were appalling. Absolutely, Celtic are running about laughing and high-fiving each other at how easy it is. He doesn't even see out the season. The caretaker has to be removed. I think for his own good more than anything else, as he appeared to be falling apart in front of our eyes. And Jimmy Nicol and Jonathan Johansson take the team for the last couple of matches of the season. The announcement, when it comes, we'll get to in a minute, but that was as appalling a spell as any throughout the journey.
Important to mention as well, because that's the dates that we were actually at. It's not inconceivable. That Celtic game we were talking about, the 5-0 game, I was at that game, and it was 5-0 after 50 minutes, David. It was 5-0 thinking, oh my goodness, this could actually be 10. And if you remember, Jack Alnwick was in goals that day, and he actually performed really well. He kept it at 5, and I shudder to say that.
It could have, if they'd really, really pushed that day, they could have got to. They were having enough fun taking the piss out of us, but had they just decided the last half hour to really go for it, then it could have been a record score, and we couldn't have complained. That's the worst part. We could not have complained.
And if you look at what a manager there was coming into, you're working with guys that are never Rangers quality, but he's going to have to somehow, take a dozen of them and try and build them back up again and put blocks around them. So whoever was coming in at that point had a job. But the thing was that at that point where Graeme Murty was in, we had, the embarrassment of the after press conferences and stuff. The news began to circulate around Steven Gerrard potentially coming in. So that somewhat overshadowed what was going on the pitch, because everybody was just like, right, this is an absolute mess, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think as soon as everybody heard, Steven Gerrard, I certainly remember talking to the boys about it on that day that we took that hiding, that he's coming, and we were pretty sure he was coming in. So everybody was at least hopeful of that. And the thing about Steven Gerrard is, I know that he didn't have that experience. It just didn't matter. We needed something at that point, David. We needed hope, and he was that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as we're telling the story of his appointment, it kind of feels like recalling the first date you had with your partner, doesn't it? It's kind of it's such a happy ending, but we were low. There was, of course, the Lee Wallace and Kenny Miller situation, which played out in the papers. There was, Graeme Murty, as Stevie alluded to there, was broken. I mean, there's really no other word for it. He was a mess. He looked a mess. You could tell this was a guy who was struggling very, very much. I thought he looked ill. And I feared for his mental health at that point, and that was one of the reasons why, in terms of removing him, I thought you have to do that for his own good. He can't be allowed to wither on that vine. And having to sack your caretaker manager is never a great look, or remove him at least. And then it was in a newspaper. Rangers are interested in Steven Gerrard, and I'll be honest. At first, Stevie, I thought, bollocks. Just another one of these clickbait, big name, link him to the job story, nothing in it. Because at this point, it seems we've been looking for a manager for the best part of 2 years, really, doesn't it? The stories had been so often, and so many names had been floated, that it was, you were just used to it, I think, at that point. You were just used to people being quoted for the job. But then I remember hearing from someone who you would know these things. And he said to me, yeah, Gerrard is a possibility with Gary McAllister. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Is it realistic? And they said, oh yeah, it's real. He's interested. And I said, right, okay. And a few days passed, and then I remember people will like this story, but it is true. I phoned a guy I knew at the Daily Record, and I said, have you heard this Gerrard McAllister thing? He says, hold on, and I'll ask. Well, I think you can imagine the journalist that he asked. And he came back with a one-word answer to me, and he said, shite. I said, right, okay, just what I'd been told. And he went, well, I'm going to check it out. He said, because don't let your head swell, but you've generally got better sources at Rangers than we have. So, which even then was true. And then Gerrard goes on BT Sport Champions League coverage. He's asked about it, and he says, yes, there are discussions, that there's an interest there in the job, and we'll see what happens. And then, I don't know about you, I at first, when I heard that, Stephen, went, nah, it's, really a youth coach, nah, big name, great, but it's not going to happen. But then once it became clear it was serious, I don't know why, I just really wanted it. And I just had such a good feeling about him. And I remember right up until his announcement, worrying that it was going to fall through, basically. And again, this was entirely just feeling. It wasn't based on anything. Yeah, he was a wonderful player. Yes, he's very glamorous. Yes, he's a big name, but not as a manager, as a player. But there was a feeling, it felt right.
Yeah, I mean, I was very much like you. As soon as it was mentioned, you kind of dismiss it and you think, well, as you alluded to, we've been here now for the best part of 2 years looking for this. So it comes and goes. But like you, I mean, that was at the start of Four Lads Had a Dream. So information, as you know, at that time wasn't like it is now. It's not as professional, and there you could find out things. Somebody actually messaged the blog, and it was a very random thing, and they said, believe it or not, people will laugh at this. It's one of these ones we laugh about on Follow and things. He says, I'm best friends with Mick Beale, and he's packed up and they're on their way up. Gerrard's 100% taking over at Rangers. And the first thing, I was like, who is Mick Beale? And it was the ignorance of it all. Went and looked it up and things, and then obviously spoke to Chris and people that I knew in the media at that point. And it then grew arms and legs. And I don't know if you remember, just before Stephen went on the Champions League show during the week, Mark Guidi had put it out on the Sunday night that he was coming, and then there was confusion that he might have been coming as assistant manager, and then obviously it kind of firmed up and he spoke about it. But it's like you, as soon as it became a possibility, I wanted it to happen, and he just. It was that thing that I needed to believe in, David. I needed something at that point. The way things were going on the pitch, we needed a figurehead. We needed something that we could galvanise behind, and it was Steven Gerrard. I mean, the guy is just at that point a worldwide football figure. Had done some amazing things on the pitch. Had basically won a Champions League on his own, and we were getting him. We didn't know the levels. I mean, I didn't sit and think, well, we might get Jermaine Defoe and things off the back of that. I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking he's going to take us back to some sort of level of normality of where we should be heading to. And he did, obviously. But he was, that's all I talk about at that time, and we talk about when it was announced and things. He was that hope that everybody needed.
Yeah, and Stephen alluded to early on the press conference, the now legendary press conference where he lets go, and that was adopted by Rangers fans just off the cuff. He's been asked about it since, and he said it was just the words that came out that day. Wasn't any great plan behind it, but if you watch it back now, he's nervous. You can see that now that we know him better. You can see that he's nervous, but he goes out and there's 8,000 bears there, and he couldn't believe it. He said that himself, and he got a little bit giddy with it, but immediately he announces his backroom team, and it is impressive. It's Gary McAllister, who, as well as being very respected figure in the game, former Leeds United manager, had a spell as Aston Villa assistant manager, great experience for that level. Michael Beale, one of the most respected coaches in international football. I mean, he writes books, he's well known, he's a highly sought after speaker at coaching events. Thomas Culshaw, obviously a couple of other guys. And the thing that I liked about that, Stephen, was this is not somebody who was just, going about his business and got a phone call and thought, yeah, I actually would like to be a manager. This was somebody who has been planning his step into management. He knows it's going to happen, and he's already assembled his team, because with the best will in the world, Michael Beale doesn't come and be a coach at Rangers or any SPFL club, by the way. He doesn't arrive to do that because it's the SPFL. He does it because it's Steven Gerrard asking him.
Absolutely. I think he alluded to that as well in a meeting that they had. I think you talk about it, that Steven Gerrard spoke to him in Melwood at Liverpool, and he was all in because of Steven Gerrard. But I was a little bit, obviously I knew about Gary Mack. I had to go and research into who Mick Beale was and Tom Culshaw and things. But we had something, David, that we hadn't had in previous years, in terms of Mark Warburton brought David Weir because of who David Weir was, his kind of relationship with Rangers and things like that. Steven Gerrard brought a team to succeed because he put the right people around him. Right down to fitness guys, right down to club doctors. You could immediately feel that we were building something. And that was different already to anything that we'd had in the last few years. So the immediate kind of feeling surrounding it, past the press conference, the management being announced, we had something that we could put faith in. We had a setup, and there was immediately talk of working with Mark Allen, getting a scouting network, getting proper, things in place at the training ground and things like that. And it was everything that we wanted to hear, all the buzzwords, everything that we needed to believe in that we hadn't have. And the great thing is we can sit here now 3 years later and we look back in hindsight and say, well, they actually did do it. But at the time we believed in it. And that's what everybody needed at the time. And to put those building blocks in place, the experience of Gary Mack, as you said, and then Mick Beale coaching wise, we know now exactly what he brings and the level of expertise he brings. I don't think we'll realise just how good this management team is until they're not there. But we'll not talk about that, obviously, because we're talking about the positives, David. But I mean, we were starting off a journey, and very quickly you started to see it all come together. And even the likes of the stuff that happened at Auchenhowie and the levels they took that up straight away, everybody bought into it immediately, and it was exciting. I remember just being buzzing and exciting. I remember that Bury game, one of his first games at Ibrox, and people streaming in, and the excitement surrounding that, and even though the opposition weren't that high, the immediate changes were exciting for me, as if to say this is going to be a journey that we're going to enjoy with him in charge.
There were 42,000 there that night, and
Friday night, wasn't it?
Yep. And Steven Gerrard has said since he couldn't believe it. He genuinely could not believe it, and he'd heard this story about how Alex Ferguson at one of his early Man United games sort of looked round at the place and the amount of fans, and he went, big club this. And it was almost like he knew about it, but he had to see it to sort of believe it. And Gerrard said for him, it was that Bury game of all matches where he's like, good Lord, there's 40,000 people here to see us play, as you say, Bury. And he was staggered by it. And then we go into his first summer. Now, complete squad rebuild was needed. The previous squad was nowhere near good enough for what we needed to be. A lot of players were shipped out, and a lot of players came in. If you want a full breakdown of who left and who came in, then please go and listen on the Heart and Hand Network to our show Through the Windows, which covers every arrival and every departure at Rangers since 1990. But when he arrived, Stephen, I heard this, you heard this, and we've communicated it to the supporters, so it's not us going, look how ITK we are. This is something that we have discussed. That when he was discussing with Mark Allen about his rebuild, the key players he'd identified from watching Rangers previously, and he'd been up, of course, at that 3-2 game, but the guys he identified as being important that he felt he would be building around were James Tavernier and Alfredo Morelos. I don't think that's a huge surprise to anyone to hear that. But the others was Jordan Rossiter, and I think we understand the reasoning behind that. He obviously knew Jordan Rossiter. Josh Windass and Greg Docherty. Fair to say that some of those go on to greatness and some of them, for different reasons, don't go on. But I don't think in summer 2018 that was an unreasonable assessment of what he had at the club.
No, absolutely not. I remember thinking in terms of what we had there was maybe about 6 or 7 he could get a tune from and a dozen that he could have in total for a squad, because you can't change 20 people in one. You can't change a full squad, so you have to do it gradually. And I think another key thing, David, and remember, I was certainly very vocal. I remember Heart and Handwear as well, is trying to tell the support, because we are obviously a very demanding and we want instant success, but trying to tell everybody this is a long transition in terms of we're talking 5, 6, 7 windows before he's able to get it right. So we have to be patient. We have to stick with this, because it can't be another situation where in 6 months' time we're looking for change. So that was very important as well. This was going to be a gradual fix. And the first priority, David, in terms of, identifying people would be guys like that. And the thing about it is as well, if you look at those boys, it's not unreasonable at the time to think that these would have been the guys that you could have built around, especially, I think, Josh Windass. And he must now be kicking himself, because we know that the manager, the story goes that he didn't want to play out left. He wanted to play up front or just behind the front man, and he wasn't prepared to kind of work with the manager on that, and that's why he left. But I just think he must be looking at it right now. I think that the manager, our coaching staff, they could have improved him and really taken him on, and no disrespect to where he is now, but he's now at Wigan and he's not going to reach these heights again, and we could have given him that platform. And I happen to think he was quite a handy player. He certainly had a finish, he had the pace, so I've no doubts that if he had allowed it, he could have flourished there. So the ones that did stay and prepared to work with Gerrard, James Tavernier, Alfredo Morelos, Ryan Jack, look at the improvement in them now. So it's not unreasonable to have earmarked them as being the ones to work with. But everybody knew, David, I think everybody knew at that point that defence was the big job. We have to get defenders in that can head and clear the ball and defend. So that was job one. And you look at the boys that he did immediately bring in, they're still more or less the mainstays now.
Well, on that, Alan McGregor and Scott Arfield arrived, two, I thought, no-brainers, and I think they've proven to be, just wonderful signings. On free transfers, you absolutely have to snap guys up like that, and especially the situation we were in then. The big money really that gets spent, you're absolutely right, is Connor Goldson and Niko Katic in that first window. They're where the investment goes, and then later that window, Borna Barisic comes in as well, and that's the chunk of the spend. A lot of the other stuff is done with loans or bringing in guys that you knew, like John Flanagan. One of the interesting things, and this is where, when we're speaking about evolution and things and changes, that summer he brings in, of course, Ovie Ejaria and Ryan Kent, players that he knows from Liverpool. So I think all managers do this, that they like to bring in guys they know. Even, super experienced managers will go back to an old club and bring in a trusted lieutenant or a player that, I know I can work with him. He also brought in Joe Worrell, of course, who was a player that he spotted in his time in England. But over the years, then this bringing in players, particularly on loan of academy players from England has stopped. Now, Rangers will still bring in the academy player, Calvin Bassey, for one, but they bring him in permanently. It's not just to bring him in for a year to help out. Now, I wonder if this is twofold, Stephen. And the first part of this change is one, we've got more money. So obviously you can shop at a higher end of the market. And there's no doubt that being able to go and bring in guys like you mentioned Defoe, but I would also argue Hadji, Cedric Etienne, as your backup players means that you've got a better quality. So you don't need to go and bring in academy players for England. But I also wonder if there was that realisation that, Ryan Kent was an outstanding success and that's brilliant, but the others didn't really work out. That at Rangers, it was almost like putting a plaster on, and that'll do just now, but eventually we're going to need to fix it properly. That these guys, they can't, they can't succeed really at Rangers simply because the pressure's too much, and they're just not up to it at that age. And the reliance on that was maybe more due to circumstance than any great long-term plan.
I agree with that. I think that at that point as well, we had so much to fix, David, that it couldn't all be done at once, but there was things that we needed to just put in place as building blocks in terms of getting to the next stage. So in order to get to Joe Aribo, we had to have Ove Ejaria, and that's not a slight on Ove or a discredit, but they're very similar players. But when you look at in terms of Joe Aribo having the mentality and the character to succeed, he had a similar start to Ejaria in terms of we liked the way the look of him, we liked his quality, we like his skill. Very similar players, but Ejaria didn't have the mentality to cope at Rangers, whereas Joe Aribo has. And it took us, getting him then to get Aribo, if that makes sense. Much like we needed, probably one of the signings that Steven Gerrard needed straight away was somebody like Yanis Hadji to break the lines and be a bit different. But we had to sort the defence first. We had to then get the midfielder. We had to get a winger. So these were things that were priorities over getting, somebody like Hadji. So everything had to be built towards where we are now. And obviously we're not in a position where we can go and spend 50 million in a summer. But he had to be shrewd. And I think that's another great thing about Steven Gerrard in terms of there's not too many deals that we've done that haven't worked for him. We've had to be patient with some of them, particularly Borna Barisic. And I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I was an instant fan of him. I wasn't. There was particular games where I would have quite happily put him out. And there's then that obvious Liverpool friendly turning point which we've spoke about before. But I think overall the business that Gerrard's done has been pretty flawless. When you look at money spent, there's only really been Eros Grezda that you could say hasn't really completely worked out.
Yeah, it was a total waste of money. Yeah. Yeah,
and then even if you are going to argue and say the likes of Cedric Etienne hasn't performed and might move on because he's not getting a lot of football and stuff like that, he still made a massive contribution to what we've done this year, and we're not going to lose money on that investment. So everything that Steven has done has been, I think it's been built, and that's why the evolution, a title of this show is so good, because like you say, the little plasters, the likes of Ejaria, he's still taking us to the next step. He's still been like a bridging gap into where we needed to go because everything can't have been fixed. The same as Ross McCrory was such an important player at spells in his first year, but he never was going to be the permanent fixture, the ultimate midfielder,
the long-term answer.
Yeah, exactly. He was a means to an end at that point. And again, that's not criticism. He just wasn't where we needed to go. So in terms of that early business, it all made sense. It was all sensible, and it really kicked us on. I don't think for one second, Kyle Lafferty arrives later on in that window. Kyle Lafferty, I don't think was ever Steven Gerrard's kind of player, but at £400,000, he was the man that could do the job at that point. So everything we done and we kicked off, we instantly looked better, even quickly. And that's the thing. We went. If you look back at the team to where we are now, obviously there's a few players in it that are still there, Tav and Jack, Morelos, and things like that. But it was a philosophy that we immediately built into the high press, the attacking football, the passing. It was all better than it was before. And obviously the instant European success that Stephen had in qualifying, it gave us belief. Everything transitioned. Everything was in transition to where we wanted to go. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to say. That
yeah,
we could trust it. We could believe in it, because even if it wasn't perfect, even if the results weren't great, and we had some patchy results, especially for 6 months, we knew that it was going in the right direction, and we were all buying into it, and that was key.
Oh, we'll come to that next week. Don't worry. We'll come to that first season, and as you say, some great results and some poor ones. But yeah, I think you're right when you say that he always struck you as having an overall philosophy. But more importantly, we'd had philosophy managers, a strategy. Because it's all right having a philosophy and saying, I want us to do this. But what are your outcomes? What's the aim? And how are you going to get there? A philosophy is a nice thing to have, but you have to break it down. And similarly, you've got to have short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals, and you can't concentrate too much on one of them at the expense of the others. Otherwise, you'll fall flat. And I think we always got the impression that was in place. I want to talk to you about something because of the playing careers. The guy that he was always compared to and always will was Frank Lampard as a player. And of course, both of them began their coaching career at the same time. So there's a wonderful serendipity there for the press. And had you looked at these two, I'm not, this is not an important point, but I'm using it to illustrate something about Gerrard that I think is really interesting. Had you looked at the two of them as players, Gerrard was that swashbuckling, free-form type of player, that inspirational Roy of the Rovers type player. Lampard was much more the star cog in a brilliant machine. He played in a different way. He played in a team that absolutely, the best teams that Lampard played in, they had a wonderful effectiveness, and they all knew their jobs and they all knew their responsibilities the other way, etc. Had you looked at the two of them, then I would have thought as managers their philosophies would have been the other way around. Whereas Gerrard has, right from the start, always been clean sheets, back four, do your work, control of the ball, control of the match. Lampard's teams at Derby and at Chelsea never seemed to quite strike that balance. They were capable of some breathtaking football on occasions, but on other occasions they were capable of looking like they didn't understand. You've got to try and keep the other side out of your box and from scoring. And it's a strange one when you look at Gerrard the player, that as a manager, I don't really think he's like that. I think he's much more about structure, shape, discipline, defensive responsibility, which is why he loves Ryan Kent, because Ryan Kent is an astonishingly good player going forward, but my goodness, he will not shirk out of getting back the way and helping out and making sure he's covering for his fullback. But I do think it's quite interesting in terms of that philosophy, because obviously Gerrard played under a number of managers. I would argue that the one who appears to have influenced him the most is Rafael Benitez. Now, he said in his book that he wasn't close to Benitez personally, i.e. as a friendship, but he took a lot from him. And the reason I say this is, and it struck me very early and it continues to, watch a post-match interview with Steven Gerrard and watch a post-match interview with Rafael Benitez. The word that comes up a lot between both of them is control. We had good control. I thought we had control. Play badly. We didn't have enough control. And I find that really, really interesting in terms of a look into his psyche as a manager.
Yeah, I like that you've said Benitez, because he was the one that, while you were discussing this, that came into my mind, that I think Stephen's taken the most from. That I think that's just because you remember some of the performances, like let's look back when Liverpool were successful under Benitez, the Champions League games against Chelsea, against Mourinho's Chelsea, who were free-flowing, dynamic, This is the first spell. This is before Park Your Burst Mourinho. So this is like Arjen Robben,
Damien Duff, Didier
Damien
Drogba,
Duff and Drogba. Yeah, so this was all out Chelsea. Chelsea at the most enjoyable, best times of watching for me. And Rafa Benitez went there and, got the 0-0 at Stamford Bridge and then got the 1-0 at Anfield. And it was a tactical masterclass in terms of how he set up, how disciplined they were, everybody knowing their job, everybody working hard. So I would love that to be the base of where we are. And we can say confidently, without trying to say that we are Liverpool Champions League winning side, but we can say confidently that he's taken the ethos from that in terms of how he wants the players to work and how hard they are. You make the point about Ryan Kent. Ryan Kent played 52 out of 56 games this year. Even when at times people were saying he wasn't at his best, he's so influential and so hardworking, as you point out, that he's just absolutely necessary for this team as much as possible. But on the structure thing, and on this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about you immediately seen. I remember that Bury game, the Bury game at home, and obviously being 6-0, and they are, English League 2 and things like that, so you don't want to overly read things. But I remember just immediately how high we were and how pressing we were, and immediately being impressed by watching that. And that obviously transferred into the early European games and early kind of league games and things like that. But it was that structure that he's obviously taken. He's obviously, we know now, and you've spoken to him, and I've spoken to him a couple of times, that he's a highly intelligent guy, and he commands that respect from everybody. Just when you're in the room, he has an aura of status. If that the same kind of status that Walter had, if Dick Advocate had,
very similar.
He has that presence.
Yeah, he walks into a room, and okay, he's very famous, but you get, there are just certain people that when they walk into a room, you notice their arrival, and I think he's like that. He has that. I don't think you can quantify it or identify specifically what it is, but you know it when you see it. Walter has it. Souness has it. He has it. Dave King has it. It's just a presence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when that comes to speaking to the players in the dressing room and players wanting to come and play for Steven Gerrard, I think that will transfer onto us, onto the park also, because you get a guy like Ryan Kent, who I think is a perfect one to speak about in terms of Ryan Kent comes as an attacking winger who traditionally maybe doesn't put in as much effort going backwards, but he has bought into everything. He's bought into the philosophy, he's bought into Rangers, he's bought into the team, and this is a guy that, doesn't need to hate our biggest rivals, but he does because he buys into everything, and that to me is the effect of Gerrard, the dressing room, the right environment, everything like that from him is transferred onto the team. You can just, I'm maybe not coming across as well. I'm trying to explain it, but it's difficult to explain, David, because we've seen it, right? We've been supporting Rangers, 30, 40 years, going to games and things like that. And sometimes you can have the best people on the touchline, but it doesn't transfer onto the team. But everything that I see in the team now, and even early, they were buying into it. Everyone bought into Steven Gerrard. Everyone bought into what he was trying to do. And when you talk about the Lampard kind of situation, you look at Lampard at Chelsea, it didn't seem like people were buying into that at all. Because how many times did we speak to each other after games and say, they're just not organised, there doesn't look to be a philosophy. Whereas even when we haven't been good, and even when we haven't performed, not this season, but if you look at previous years when things didn't go our way, you can always see what we're trying to do. And I think that has come from Steven Gerrard being very early on, having a lot of trust in guys like Michael Beale, Tom Culshaw, Gary McAllister doing the training, and him overseeing everything. But they've at times, how many times did we say they've not really went from 4-3-3 and things like that? But in reality, they have slightly made tweaks here and there, but they've always kept to their philosophy. They've always kept to what they believed in. and eventually knowing that it would bring us to where we are now. But that level of patience and the level of trust in their own self and ability has transferred onto the team as well. And that's why we can see, everything kind of grown to where it was now. Because although we'll cover it, what we've done this season has been phenomenal in terms of being unbeaten and invincible and everything else. But it's taken a 3-year evolution to get there for these players to grow. And that's down, how much trust has Gerrard put in the likes of Connor Goldson? But they've also put trust in the management as well, which I think goes back to what you're saying, your comparisons of Lampard and Gerrard, because I didn't see Chelsea players trusting Lampard the way our squad does Gerrard. So I think that's a perfect kind of analogy of both of them, if that's the right word, I'm not sure it is, but of both of them together and how it's worked for one and not the other.
Yeah, and look, it's just one of these storylines, I suppose, that will always exist just because of the time they both come through. But I as you said, you and I Stevie and I watch a lot of football, and we'll chat during it. And we were talking, we watched Chelsea earlier this season and just said there's no shape, there's no structure, and it's bizarre to see such high level side. And clearly it was a managerial thing, because once they brought Tuchel in, then almost immediately you went, there's a shape. I can see what they're trying to do here. And that was never the case under Gerrard. You never looked at it. It didn't work sometimes, and we'll talk about that as we go through the seasons. But you never looked at it and went, I've no idea what they're trying to do here, which was different. I'll finish up on this, Stevie, and this is maybe a gratuitous kick at people we don't like, but we're the champions, we can do that. And I want to talk about the contrast in the press coverage of his arrival between Scotland and England. Now he's a worldwide figure, Steven Gerrard. He's one of the most famous footballers of this century, right? He's a legendary footballer. So there was always going to be more interest in him than had we appointed, with the best will in the world, Derek McInnes. But and thanks to Twitter user Paul T, who posted this graphic, where he took some quotes from Scotland and England, and I'll just read you, and I'll start off with the English quotes about Gerrard's appointment. Amazing support, great stadium. I'm sure it will be a positive for him. It's great for Steven and for Rangers. He walks into the dressing room and he immediately commands total respect. I wish him all the luck in the world. His obsession will take him far. It'll be a great acquisition for anyone. I'm sure he'll be a success. Rangers will be a great opportunity for him, the chance to rebuild one of the biggest clubs in the world. And I'll contrast that with the reaction from Scotland. Pep Guardiola would struggle at Rangers. A baffling move for both parties. A needless punt for such a dysfunctional club. Flawed and reckless appointment by Rangers. Inept risk-taking. Not sure this makes sense for Rangers or Gerrard. That's quite a contrast. And I don't remember from the media much analysis of it other than this is crazy, this is a disaster. Now, we are supporters, and we will obviously try and look to the positive. I think that's common sense. And we were excited. But even with dry analysis, I don't recall that reaction being like that when Caixinha was appointed. So I don't think it was a case of us just looking at this with blue-tinted spectacles that were so full of colour we couldn't actually see anything. That reaction to me wasn't professional. That reaction to me was almost hoping and writing your hopes rather than looking at it. Now, Steven Gerrard might not have worked. There will be times in the next 3 episodes where we'll point out times where it looked as though it could very much go the other way. But the idea that he was going to be a complete and utter colossal flop, that he was, we spoke about it earlier, the team he'd put in place behind him, I thought made sure that we'll improve. We might not improve enough. Celtic might be. They should have been so far ahead of us. But I still think that the reaction was completely and utterly over the top.
Do you know the saddest thing about that, David, is we've become kind of immune to it now in terms of, like, we obviously speak quite a lot. And I don't think there's any pointing and saying otherwise. We're on the phone. God, I'm bothering you about 100 times a day with stuff. So we talk about football all the time, but we don't mention the press because we know that it's negative, and we don't now take that anymore into consideration. That it was almost like, they're at it, but we're not paying any attention to it. But like you say, when you look back on it, always remember the famous, Daily Record podcast with Keith Jackson and stuff, and the comments surrounding Steven Gerrard being amateur and, give it 6 months. You've obviously got the very famous Graham Spears quietly terrified quote and things like that. There was never any respect for Steven Gerrard coming in as being a worldwide football figure who had studied at Liverpool, at academy stages and learnt a bit of his trade and was surrounding himself with a good management team. There was never any balance in that. And I would never have any issue in balanced journalism saying, Steven Gerrard is a risk, but let's look at what he's done. Let's look at the team he's got in place. It's really exciting to watch, and let's see how it turns out. I don't think that's unfair. I don't think it's unfair if they had went through it that way. But
no, I agree.
The excitement we got in England, I remember it being, BBC 10, Big Ben strikes, and one of the top moments on it was Steven Gerrard at Rangers. And if you look at the clips now that people do, of us winning the league and stuff, there's loads of English press coverage on Sky Sports, and even the excitement, David, of Gary Lineker and stuff in that, and are you going to be a lone ranger and stuff like that? They look genuinely excited. Guys like Ian Wright, who ex-Celtic, don't need to be friends of ours, but spoke so excitedly about the job that he was going to do, and they were all excited. They were all going to watch, and England was watching, one of their favourite sons, basically. Whereas up here, it was nothing but negative. It was nothing but, this is going to be a failure. This is going to be a catastrophe. And it's almost like, as we know, anything to do with Rangers as a club, it has to be negative because that's the way they want it to go. But it was never ever going to be like that for me. It was never ever going to be a disaster. Even if it didn't work out, I was still 100% sure that Steven Gerrard would take us on the right direction, So it wasn't like he would leave it in a Pedro Caixinha state. He was always going to take us to where we needed to go, even if he didn't get us over the line. So I was never worried about it being a disaster. I was always quite confident, but nobody looked at it, sensibly. And I don't know about you, David. Let's fire it back at you. I mean, how did you feel reading that? Were you affected, or was it just a case of this is what it's like now?
Yeah, no, I did exactly that. I agree. It bounces off. And again, what Rangers did, which was just note the comments and think, okay, every dog has its day. We'll see where this ends up. But you're right. I just thought it was. I don't understand people who, because of their partisan support, will allow themselves to look stupid in their profession. I would never say something, and I'm fan media, I would never say something as ridiculous as the Spears quote, for example, because I wouldn't want to look that stupid. I wouldn't want people to think I know so little about my profession. But that's a level of professional pride that clearly you or I or the listeners might have that isn't shared by others. But it is fun to be able to go back and look at it now. And
it's funny, David. Sorry, it's just I'm going to say, see what you just said there. That's so true. In terms of, we've both done a lot of things recently on telly, radio, and things because Rangers have been successful. And I was on Sky just before we played Celtic at Ibrox in the final game, and they were talking about going invincible and stuff like that. And I went on and said that Celtic were still a good side, still a dangerous attack, still had good players, and was really respectful about it, because it would have been folly on my part to go on and say, they were rubbish and they were this and they were that, and for it to come back in my face. And that's just me, as like you said, a small blog or whatever. But I had more respect for that situation than anyone at that time ever showed Rangers.
Exactly, and it's not about them. It's about you or I or anyone of the listeners listening. We have too much pride in ourselves to say, I'm going to say this stupid thing because it'll annoy other people. We don't do that. I mean, I make comments that are designed to annoy people, but at the same time, they're not designed to make me look stupid down the line. You know, I would never sit and say, oh, Rangers are fantastic, we're going to win the Champions League next year, because I'd look stupid when we don't.
We say it to each other, though.
Say it to each other, and I put a tenner on every year. I put a tenner on every year for Rangers to win whatever European competition we're going into. So, yeah, but, you know, I wouldn't go and make that claim publicly. It's been a lot of fun, Stephen. Next week, we'll have ups and downs. So strap yourself in, because we're going to go to season 2018-19, Steven Gerrard's first in charge. There are high points, folks. There are low points. There are tricky opponents. Don't know about you, but after that season, Stephen, if I'd never seen Kilmarnock again, I would have been quite happy. I think we played them 43 times that season before the year was out. But we will dive into tactics. We will dive into how the signings got on. We'll dive into Steven Gerrard, the public manager, about some of his interviews. And I think that that's an interesting area that's developed in his career. And I hope that you've enjoyed this show, everyone. I look forward to next week. Stevie, thank you so much for doing this.
No, of course, a pleasure to come on, and especially to talk about Steven Gerrard. One thing we didn't touch on, David, is, you know, perhaps how we feel about him now. But I don't think it's necessary. The guy is just... What more can we say? It's a pleasure to have him as our manager.
The only disappointment is the 200 yards you and me need to stay away from him due to a court order. But apart from that, we love him. Maybe a bit too much, and that's why that rule is in place. Right, we'll be back next week, folks. Thank you so much. Remember, check out Stevie's work over on Four Lads Had a Dream, and we'll talk to you next week when we'll get right into the guts this season 2018-19. Until then, stay safe, take care. Bye-bye.